Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man just recently finished its first season. Going in, judging by the trailers, I expected it was going to be just one more piece of low-effort content slop crap down onto Disney+. But after watching it, I found it surprisingly didn't actually suck. It's actually a pretty decent superhero show that explores the themes and ideas of the genre a lot better than a lot of recent superhero stuff has been doing. But if you're looking for a one-to-one Spider-Man adaptation, this ain't it, because they change a lot. And I mean a lot. It starts out pretending to be an MCU what-if style story, but by the end goes off in its own direction, with some aspects that are a lot closer to the comic source material than the MCU's ever been, and some things that are drastically different than both the comics and the movies. The goal here clearly isn't to be a direct adaptation, but it can still be very interesting to compare how they chose to adapt these characters from the comics, to see how different a character can be while still being similar enough to be an actual adaptation of that character. So I've used my trademarked 3C's system to rate each character in the show by their comic book accuracy and rank them all from worst adapted to best adapted. For those of you being introduced to the 3C's from this video, they stand for costume, character, and continuity. Costume rates a character's outfit or costume, their overall look, and their superficial physical characteristics. Character rates their personality, their relationships with others, and their powers or abilities. And continuity rates their origin story, their iconic moments, and their overall place in the world, universe, or timeline. And as I always say, though nobody listens, a character's placement on this ranking is not a judgment of them as a character within this universe, or of this universe as a whole. It's only how close to the source material they are in relation to other characters on this list. So, starting off the ranking with the character who ranked the absolute lowest as the clear and inarguably worst adapted character of the show at number 34 is Ricochet. Ricochet was Johnny Gallo, a member of the Stingers, a group of 4 heroes inspired by and using the costumes and code names Peter Parker had worn during a time when he couldn't use his identity as Spider-Man. He's a mutant with the powers of agility and a danger sense. He cracks jokes while fighting crime to a higher degree than even Spider-Man himself. In Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, he is none of those things at all. He's a serious security guard working for Norman Osborn who looks and acts absolutely nothing like the comic version. Like, at all. Norman did falsely submit his name as Spider-Man's civilian identity to the government to abide by the Sokovia Accords, so that's kinda like him wearing a costume Spider-Man wore once, eh? But that was the Slinger's costume Peter did not actually wear in this show, so I'm taking that back and moving on. Next at 32 we have Wave. In the show, Pearl Pongin is a girl Peter's known for years that he's had a crush on all that time. But she starts going out with Lonnie. When things deteriorate with Lonnie, she starts developing feelings for Peter as well. In the comics, Peter does not have feelings for her. She also doesn't go to school with him. She also doesn't have feelings for Lonnie or even live in the same country as either of them or know either of them at all. She's a superhero from the Philippines with the power to control and breathe water, as well as swim at superhuman speeds. Besides her name and having been on the swim team at her high school, the characters share absolutely nothing in common, and I'm very confused why they used this name for her instead of one of the many students Peter did go to school with. At 31 we have Butane. This name was either a mistake or someone up top told them last second they couldn't use the name Scorcher for some reason. Butane in the show and Scorcher in the comics are both villains who fought Spider-Man and wear armor that shoots flames. But this guy's name is Butane, and we never know his civilian name, so he's rated compared to the incredibly obscure character named Butane in comics, who is one of many people who were transformed by a reality warp that swept across the UK and became known as the Warpies. The show version has nothing to do with this character, so that makes me 100% sure that Sony stepped in and told him they couldn't use the name Scorcher because he's going to be the headliner of the next big Spider-Man villain movie to follow, the wildly successful Kraven the Hunter, in the wildly successful Sony shared Spider-Man universe. Oh, they canceled that whole thing? Well, then I have no idea what happened here. Moving on. At 30, we leap up to Leapfrog. Vincent Petillo in the comics developed a pair of mechanized legs that allow him to leap great distances, and for God knows what reason, he put them into a frog costume to start committing crimes. He's well known for his laughably unsuccessful supervillain career and eventually retired, though his legacy is continued by his son, who tries to redeem the name as the heroic but often completely inept Frogman. In the show, Vincent is a scientist working as an assistant/hype man to Otto Octavius. Besides wearing a green shirt, he's got nothing whatsoever to do with frogs. I mean, he could get some mechanized frog legs later on and hop around, but I doubt this version of the character would have the same charm as the comic version. Sadly, this is the second time the MCU's effed up Leapfrog, so I don't think we're going to get another chance at him. Up to 29 with The Wizard. In comics, Bentley Whitman was a genius who uses his immense intellect to commit crimes and battle the Fantastic Four, both to prove himself the intellectual superior to Reed Richards and to direct the spotlight to himself to feed his immense ego. In the show, he's just a scientist working for Norman Osborn that directs Peter and other interns in their work at Oscorp. He's a bit of a curmudgeon, but really looks and acts nothing whatsoever like the comics. Next at 28 we have Unicorn. In the comics, Milos Masaryk was a Soviet agent who was sent to take out the defector Anton Vanko and faced off against Iron Man. He wears a helmet that can shoot powerful energy beams out of its horn, levitate objects, create a force field, and other pretty awesome abilities. In the show, Milo is gender swapped to Mila for some reason and is a Russian criminal working with others to steal money. She uses that money to purchase a helmet from Otto Octavius that can shoot laser beams and breaks her comrades out of prison before beating the crap out of Spider-Man. Sadly, instead of wearing a weird costume to go along with the name and gimmick like the comics, she just wears regular clothes. Now up to 27 with Carmilla Black. In the comics, Carmilla was an operative for S.H.I.E.L.D. known as Scorpion, with no relation whatsoever to the original Scorpion. She was genetically engineered when young to grant her immunity to most all toxins, as well as store those poisons up so she can discharge them from her left arm. In the show, toss away all of that. She's the second in command of the Scorpions gang under Mac Gargan and uses knives to fight. Similarities are the green hair, the black top, and that's about it. She's also the second Scorpion after Gargan, so that's something? At 26, we reach the greatest Marvel hero of all time, NFL Super Pro. NFL Super Pro was originally Phil Grayfield, a professional football player who suffered a career-ending injury, heroically rescuing a child. After becoming a sports reporter, he interviewed an NFL fan/inventor who developed a super football uniform so strong it could deflect bullets. During the interview, criminals broke in, stole valuable NFL memorabilia, kidnapped the fan, and started the memorabilia room on fire with Phil still in it. After being covered in fire, sports memorabilia, and experimental chemicals, Phil rises up, puts on the super uniform, and breaks out to stop the criminals, now dedicating his life to fighting all crime as Super Pro. In the show, Phil Grayfield is the coach at Peter's school who tries to get Lonnie to focus on football, but is forced to kick him off the team when he keeps missing practices. And until they explicitly tell me otherwise, I'll just assume he's moonlighting as Super Pro. Now up to 26 with Asha. Asha is one of the interns working with Peter under Bentley Whitman and Norman Osborn. She is a genius from Wakanda. In the comics, she is from Wakanda, but is not specifically a scientific genius. She has light powers that allow her to absorb light, shoot lasers, turn invisible, and other light-type abilities. If they want to give her these powers at some point, she'd shoot right up. Not that anyone I think would really care. She's not a very big character, but for now she stays right here. Up to 24, we have Chameleon. Besides the mask, this character is not Chameleon at all. In the show, he's one of the Russian criminals Unicorn breaks out of prison. He shows up later wearing a mask to hide his identity since he's a wanted fugitive. That's all. In the comics, Chameleon is a master of disguise, able to perfectly imitate others' voices and mannerisms, and can make masks indistinguishable from those he's disguised as, even to those who know them well. I'd assume they'll have him turn out to be a master of disguise in the future, but for now he's just a guy in a mask. Up to 23, we reach Rhino. Or I think it's Rhino. For some reason, his name is Mikhail instead of Oleski, but he's got a tattoo of a wall breaking and pitched Unicorn to use the name Rhino, so there? If it is Rhino, besides not having the, Rhino suit, they do act somewhat similar. Both versions are criminals who solve their problems by charging headfirst into them. In the comics, quite literally. In the show, by driving straight into other cars to escape the police. And though both versions are bad guys, they have a softer, more honorable side. In the show, when his ally Unicorn shoots a laser at him to force Spider-Man to dive in the way to save his life, Mikhail then saves Spider-Man's life after Unicorn is about to shoot him to death after he's fallen due to saving his life. He then tells Spider-Man that they're even, but when next they meet, they'll still be enemies. So, if they're setting him up as Rhino, he should be fairly close. But for all we know, this is Oleski's dad or some nonsense, and they're setting up a teen Rhino to be Spider-Man's sidekick next season or something stupid like that. Now at 22, we reach Tarantula. Both show and comic versions have a streak of red in their hair and use wrist blades to fight, and that's about where the similarities end. The show version is a low-level criminal who buys tech with her boyfriend that enhances her abilities. In the comics, she's a hero, well, anti-hero at least, who is a master martial artist who becomes a hero to avenge her sister by working alongside Misty Knight in the Heroes for Hire. She wears a full costume in the comics, while in the show, like most of the villains, she just wears a jacket and some random tech crap. And there have been multiple tarantulas in the comics, and they decided to pick one of the few who were not a villain. So, still nothing like the comics, but more similar because of the blades, I guess. Up to 21 with Big Ben Donovan. Big Ben Donovan was a lawyer who, after a misunderstanding and fight, became an ally to Luke Cage. But after his brother was killed, he fell into a spiral and wound up using his immense strength on a path for vengeance that led him to becoming a criminal. In the show, he's the leader of the 110th Street Gang that forces Lonnie Lincoln to join him. He later shows himself to be a coward when he runs from a gang fight. At 20, we have Screwball. Screwball is a criminal who streams herself while committing crime for online views. She's not technically in the show, but her name appears in the chat when Spider-Man is stream fighting criminals, telling people to watch her channel instead. So she does exist out there in some capacity and is a streamer. Sadly enough, that is enough to get higher than anyone else so far in this list. Now up to 19 with The Lizard. So far, the Lizard himself has not appeared in the story, or his alter ego Kirk Connors. He's been Rule 63'd into Carla Connors in this universe. She's one of the scientists guiding the interns at Oscorp. She has one arm, is a scientist in a lab coat, and most importantly, wears purple pants. If she winds up turning herself into a lizard while researching how humans can regrow limbs later on, she'll jump up a bit on this list despite the obvious changes. But if they race swap the lizard into a gecko or something, I'm dropping her way down. Now up to 18 with Nico Minoru. Nico in the comics is a member of the Runaways, a group of teens who learn that their parents are part of a villainous organization known as the Pride. The teens team up and run away to oppose their evil parents. Nico's parents are dark magic users for the group, and she learns that she has inherited magic abilities as well. She uses an incredibly powerful magic staff that appears to her through blood magic and can grant any wish, but only once. In the show, Nico is Peter's best friend who goes to the same school as him. We know nothing of her backstory except that she lives in a foster home and has a picture of her parents in her room. She does not have a staff as of yet, but does have an amulet that has, as of yet, unknown magical abilities. Whether or not her parents are still villains, we don't know. But we do know that the amulet is connected to and allows her to speak to her mother in some way, implying that her entire backstory may be very different. She does not go to school with Peter Parker and is definitely not his best friend. My guess is she's just a favorite of one of the show writers, so they found a way to squeeze her in. At 17, we reach Tombstone. Comic Tombstone was born with a form of albinoism that made him ostracized growing up. He channeled this into rage, becoming a bully and later a criminal and hitman, becoming known as Tombstone because of how many he's killed in his career. After coming into conflict with Spider-Man and others, he is eventually exposed to an experimental gas called Diox-3 in an Oscorp lab that greatly enhanced his physical abilities. In the show, Lonnie Lincoln has a normal skin tone growing up and is a popular and friendly member of the school's football team. He forms a friendship with Peter and begins dating Pearl, but when his brother falls in with the 110th Street Gang, Lonnie offers to join instead to spare his brother. Across the show, Lonnie is forced to neglect his schoolwork, football practice, and relationships and begins forming a bond with the gang that pulls him further and further down a dark path, eventually leading to him becoming their leader. During a fight with a rival gang, Lonnie is exposed to Diox-3 in an Oscorp van transporting advanced technology and gains greatly enhanced physical abilities. And by the end of the show, his fingers have started to turn chalk white, implying that the rest of his skin may soon follow. Basically, your typical movie adaptation rewrite to make the villain more sympathetic. At 16, we have Speed Demon. Comic Speed Demon was a chemist who gained his speed through a formula given to him by the Grandmaster in exchange for joining his Squadron Sinister to fight the Avengers. Since then, he's become a professional criminal, serving on many different groups across the years. In the show, he's a low-level criminal who buys tech with his girlfriend Maria. His speed boots grant him superhuman speed, and after robbing a jewelry store, they both faced off against Spider-Man and were defeated and imprisoned. Unlike a lot of the just-wearing clothes villains in this show, Speed Demon's jacket is actually similar to the colors of his comic costume, and he's got shades similar to the red visor covering his eyes in comics as well. At 15, we move to Richard Parker. When Aunt May went to prison at the end to talk to someone, I was so worried it was going to be Uncle Ben and he hadn't died, he'd just been a criminal or something crappy like that. But it turned out to be Richard Parker instead, and so I was only half annoyed. In the comics and show, Richard is Peter's dad. In the comics, he was an agent for the government who died on a mission alongside his wife Mary. In the show, he's still alive and incarcerated. For what reason? We don't know yet. Being Peter's father, no longer being in his life, and looking somewhat similar about all that get him this high. Moving up to 14, we reach Harry Osborn. When I first watched the show's trailer and Spider-Man swings in to save some middle-aged woman, I was very surprised when that middle-aged woman started speaking and turned out to be Harry Osborn. Similarities between the two are that they're both the wealthy sons of Norman Osborn. Both are friends with Peter, have strained relationships with their fathers, and are missing their mother. Comic Harry met and became friends with Peter without knowing he was Spider-Man. The show version knows he's Spider-Man very soon after meeting him due to Peter's relationship with Norman and does not become his friend explicitly until after that. And after learning, Harry goes on to become Peter's guy in the chair, which is not a Spider-Man thing. The guy's a genius. He can solve his own problems. Weirdly though, in the credits, they do show concept art for the characters and we see a pretty dang good version of a race-swapped Harry who stays much truer to the original comic design. Why they ditched that for whatever this ugly nonsense is, I have no godly idea. At 13, we move up to Amadeus Cho. Amadeus Cho is introduced as the 7th or 8th, depending on who you're asking, smartest person in the world, and uses his intellect to try to help out the Hulk. Much later on, he gets a faux hawk and starts acting a bit more bro-y and becomes a Hulk himself. This is the version the show takes inspiration from, minus the Hulk aspect. Amadeus in the show is one of the interns working alongside Peter at Oscorp. He's a bit egotistical and cocky about his intelligence. Instead of being a renegade genius fighting against the system, he's working directly with Oscorp to make a name for himself within the science world. He's likely not the 8th smartest person in the world, since he's still working under Osborn and the other scientists, and at the end, when Harry recruits most of the other interns into his new startup company, Cho chooses to stay with Osborn, so besides his look and intelligence, a very different character. Now up to 12 with Norman Osborn. Both versions are rich industrialists who run Oscorp. Both have a son named Harry, who they are distant towards, though in the comics he is much, much colder to his son. And both versions are involved in some less than scrupulous scientific endeavors. In the show, he seems a bit nicer than he's usually portrayed in the comics. Yes, he's mentoring Peter specifically to take out his rival and steal his research, and also steal Spider-Man's blood for research into his own superhuman program, but he does seem genuinely invested in helping Peter to become a good hero, even if being a hero is something a bit darker in Norman's eyes. He gets a bit weirdly excited about having Peter try out different suits, but he's more dark and serious in some episodes than others, so maybe he's already losing his grip on sanity and we're just watching its early stages. An obvious difference is he's just palette swapped into having a darker skin tone, looking so close to the comic version that I'd believe it if they just told me they dropped in the wrong color by accident and decided to just go with it. Now up to 11 with General Ross. Ross in the show seems to be taken straight out of the MCU. He's the Secretary of State and looks pretty much the same as he did in Civil War. We can never be 100% sure, but it's likely his backstory is similar to the MCU version and included him being a general, fighting the Hulk, having a daughter named Betty, yada yada yada. I've got into the MCU Ross's comparison to the comics in my Brave New World ranking, so if you're really interested, you can see more in depth on him there. And with that, we enter the top 10 most well-adapted, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man characters, starting with Scorpion. Matt Gargan was a private investigator who was hired by J. Jonah Jameson to look into Spider-Man, but was then put into an experiment that enhanced his strength, drove him mad, and bonded him to a powerful Scorpion-like armor. In the show, they took inspiration from the MCU version of Matt Gargan, who took inspiration from the Ultimate Universe version of Scorpion, neither of which ever actually wore Scorpion armor. In the show, he's the leader of the Scorpions gang, though there is a line about him finding people for a living before that, calling back to his private investigator origin in the comics. He gets his hand on the Scorpion armor to fight the 110th Street gang and Spider-Man. Like the comics, he is incredibly powerful and dangerous, killing multiple members of the gang and beating Spider-Man to a bloody pulp in their first encounter. Unlike the MCU Scorpion, who was just some guy who got arrested and went to jail, this version of Scorpion actually gets a place as one of Spider-Man's most dangerous enemies in this universe. At 9, we have Aunt May. Like the comics, May is raising Peter alone after her husband Ben was killed. She's struggling with bills and still mourns for her lost love. Like the MCU version, she's a lot younger than the comics, and she seems to have a similar relationship with Peter as the movie version does. Though, as of yet, she has not learned that he is Spider-Man. They also gave her a pretty thick New York accent. At 8, we reach Finesse. Finesse is a polymath able to master virtually any skill and understand and remember limitless information. She joins the Avengers Academy alongside many other aspiring young heroes. In the show, she's one of the interns working alongside Peter Parker at Oscorp. Like her comic counterpart, she is a genius, and later on, it reveals that she is actually already a costumed hero and is working at Oscorp undercover to learn any shady things they may be up to. Her costume is virtually one-to-one. The main difference between the two is that in the comics, due to her abilities, she is limited in her ability to express and understand emotions. In the show, though, she seems perfectly well-adjusted and normal. Up to 7, we've got Dr. Octopus. Dr. Otto Octavius was a scientist who created a harness with mechanized tentacles he could use to work with dangerous elements from a safe distance. During an accident, he gained a connection to the tentacles and was driven insane, becoming the megalomaniacal villain known as Dr. Octopus. In the show, he's not yet Dr. Octopus, and is an underground scientist selling his tech to criminals to fund his experiments. He is pretty egomaniacal and ill-tempered like his comic counterpart, and though he does have robotic tentacles among his many inventions, he has not actually worn them yet. Besides the tentacles, he looks pretty much straight out of the comics, to the point where I wonder why they didn't just do this for everyone else. It looks pretty cool. Now, he would be a bit higher in this list, but he does a weird dance when escaping the police that the comic version would just never do. But that's just in one weird episode, and in the rest he acts much closer to how Doc Ock would normally act. Up to 6, we have Crusher Hogan. Crusher Hogan is the wrestler Spider-Man first fights to win a bit of money after realizing he'd gained powers. In the show, we only see him for a second on a TV screen, but he looks just like the comics and appears to be a wrestler. A spin-off comic showed Peter Parker fighting him back when he first got his powers, but I take all spin-off comics with a grain of salt, since a lot of them get decanonized at the whims of the show or movie writers. And now, the 5 most well-adapted characters, starting with the Watcher. In the comics, the Watcher's sole task is to watch important moments across the history of the Earth, yet never interfere. Though he's been moved by the heroism of humanity to interfere on their behalf from time to time. In the show, we see the Watcher's face in the sky at the end of the show, watching as Doctor Strange and Spider-Man talk about their team-up, and Spider-Man starts to embrace his destiny as a great hero of this world. Now, so far in the MCU, the Watcher's been portrayed as watching all universes instead of just one and just the Earth, and breaking his oath non-stop for sometimes pretty comically insignificant purposes. Whether this is the Watcher of just this Earth in this universe like he should be, or all Watchers in all MCU-produced projects are that crappy Watcher from What If, we don't know yet. Until I'm explicitly told otherwise, I'll assume he's specific to this universe, but it's equally likely I'm wrong and he'll plummet out of the top 5 in the future on this list, and therefore all MCU-related lists. Now up to number 4 with the man himself, Spider-Man. This version of Spider-Man is a convoluted mixture of the MCU version, the classic comic version, and some random stuff the writers just made up for this version. Like the comics and MCU, he's a brilliant teenager who is bit by a spider and gains strength, durability, and the ability to stick to walls. He does not seem to have a spider sense, as he's hit by cars and doors multiple times, and is constantly caught masking or unmasking. But that's similar to the MCU version, who took a bit to fully develop his Peter Tingle. He developed his web formula, and like the MCU versions, wore an early version of his costume while fighting crime and saving people. Unlike the comics or MCU version, however, the spider that bit him was not a radioactive spider from a lab experiment. It came out of a portal Doctor Strange created in the sky while fighting a monster that later turned out to have opened from the future, the monster having been a symbiotic alien unleashed from space due to a Stargate Oscorp created with the help of Peter's own technology, and the spider being an Oscorp experiment using Peter's own blood, making this Peter's origin a very complicated grandfather paradox. Why? I do not know. Unlike the MCU, this version of Peter is explicitly shown to have an Uncle Ben who died. But this version's Ben appears to have died before Peter becoming Spider-Man, meaning he did not learn the iconic great power, great responsibility lesson the same way. Though this Ben is shown to have been a huge part of Peter's life that he really misses. Like the MCU Spider-Man, most of the superficial elements like costume and powers are similar. Unlike the MCU version, he also still wears glasses like he did in early comics. He also looks and acts a bit more like the comic version of Spider-Man than the MCU version does, both in and out of costume. He's less reckless and manic, and much more calm and responsible. He doesn't wear his iconic Spider-Man outfit for most of the first season, but the costumes he does wear are all taken from comic lore, including the Dusk Hornet and Prodigy costumes, as well as the costume he wore while part of the Future Foundation, though the reasons for wearing them were all very different in the comics. Though they changed a lot, and his character arc is quite different, the core of the character is there more than the MCU version is, and I don't think they'll have to bring in alternate universe Spider-Man just to teach him what being a Spider-Man even means, since he seems to be learning that lesson on his own already. Now up to the top 3, starting with Doctor Strange. Like Spider-Man, Doctor Strange is another mixture of the MCU versions and the classic Silver Age versions of the character. Visually, he looks right out of the comics, though his spells and magic are much more similar to how they're portrayed in the movies, including the use of the Time Stone within the Eye of Agamotto. We don't know much of anything about his backstory, but it can be assumed that it is at least somewhat similar to the MCU, which is also pretty similar to his comic backstory. Though the MCU versions wear the yellow gloves for one scene, they did a terrible job, and he never wore them again. But this version actually does wear them, and they look pretty cool. In the MCU, Strange already ranks pretty high as an adaptation, so adding a more comic-accurate look makes him rank even higher on here. In this show, he's tied to Peter's origin through those time travel shenanigans I referenced earlier, and he seems to be quite a bit less powerful than even the MCU version, having so much trouble with the alien symbiote that he felt the need to whip out the Time Stone to fight it. Up to 2 with Daredevil. Daredevil in the show breaks into Oscorp to find some incriminating files and tells Spider-Man not to trust Osborn. He also tasks Finesse with going undercover in Oscorp as well. He's wearing a black suit instead of his iconic red one, but this is similar to the costume he's worn in the comics, though still without the logo on the chest like the MCU Netflix versions. He's shown to have the same enhanced senses powers as in the comics and is a master fighter able to fight the far more physically powerful Spider-Man. Though there were a few moments where he seemed a little too strong against Spider-Man, but I'm not going to nitpick too much, it's a cartoon. Not a lot to say since we see so little of him, but what we do see is pretty much what you'd expect from Daredevil guest starring in a Spider-Man comic. We don't really learn a lot about him, but again, it's safe to assume he's got a similar origin and motivations for being a hero as the MCU and comic versions, but we never know. It could be that we learn later he got his powers from some radioactive material falling out of a portal in the sky caused by a time paradox or something silly like that, so we'll have to wait and see if he drops down. And at the number 1 most well-adapted, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man character, we have Iron Man. Like Doctor Strange, Iron Man is a combination of MCU and comic elements. He's not seen often in the show, but he's referenced quite a few times, letting us know he's one of the major heroes of this universe and serves with the Avengers. We also learn he's had a falling out with Captain America during a superhero civil war, similar to the MCU and the comics. There are also other references to events that mirror the MCU, but we don't get all the details about them, so we can only assume what is similar about them and what is different. In the show, we see him fly down from the sky and arrest Doc Ock for violating the Sokovia Accords by selling illegal tech to criminals. His armor and face look nothing like the MCU versions and are lifted straight from his classic comic designs, including the little slit eyes and mouth in his helmet. Now, the MCU Iron Man is pretty well adapted besides all the continuity changes like creating Ultron and mentoring Peter. Within this continuity, he is not Peter's mentor and so far hasn't even met Spider-Man. And though Sokovia is referenced, we do not know whether this version built Ultron or if events played out differently. He very well could have, but it could be just as likely that the Ant-Man we see in the Civil War photos is Hank Pym in this universe, since they seem to be taking so much inspiration from the classic comics and not just straight following the MCU. He looks like Iron Man, he acts like Iron Man. Seeing how both him and Doctor Strange were done in here makes me want to see the rest of the Avengers in this universe and hope they have some classic style costumes, especially Hawkeye. Here's hoping we can in a season 2. So there we go. Now, there were a couple characters I did not include on this ranking, those being the Prowler, who was only heard referenced on a news report as having broken into places, Hobie Brown or Aaron Davis, we do not currently know, and Bulldozer, who people seem to believe is Bulldozer from the Wrecking Crew, but since he is not on the Wrecking Crew, we never learn his real name, none of the other members of the gang have names of Wrecking Crew members, and I don't know that there's reason to believe this is supposed to be the same character, contrary to what most people online seem to just take as fact. So, people who watch this show, what do you think? Are the characters who are adapted closer to their comic counterparts better, or do you prefer the ones they just tossed a name onto or made drastic changes for? Did the changes bother you at all and you think they should have stuck closer to the MCU or closer to the comics, or is this bizarre combination of the two doing it for you? And for people who did not watch the show but watched this video, hey, thanks man. I'm glad having no idea what I'm talking about doesn't stop you from giving me a watch. Do you think this show looks any good after seeing all this, or does it seem like a bunch of random nonsense to you? If you're a huge fan of superhero cartoons, I recommend giving it a watch. It's pretty good. It doesn't fall into a lot of the trappings that a lot of superhero cartoons have, like being way too much for kids or the kind of garbage writing we seem to get so often with cartoon shows. But if you're looking for a really good Spider-Man adaptation because you hated the MCU version so much, you ain't gonna find it here, bub, so just go watch 90s Spider-Man and have a nice time. Any show, movie, or anything you want to see ranked next? Let me know below. I've got a list compiled for future videos, many of which, including this one, were suggested by fans. Like, sub, and hit that bell thing if you want to see NFL Super Pro as the next live-action MCU movie, and I'll see you next time, webheads.